Hey everyone, and welcome back to another report, or should I say for my fellow developers, what's up, my little creeps? I'm not calling you little creeps, but that sure is what one US political figure said about Silicon Valley game developers. Quite an interesting situation. Now, the actual title of this video should probably be Incumbents versus View or versus Video Games, but I might get the clicks. Anyway, today we've got two very interesting stories. Number one, Joe Biden. Number two, the NHS. One is planning a presidential run, the other is the UK Health Service, and both of them have talked about video games very recently indeed. One called developers little creeps, and the other hit out against loot boxes, and they all may play into a renewed focus on gaming. We're going to cover Joe Biden first because part of what he said actually does tie us into the NHS a little bit later. Now, for context, Joe Biden is not really a fan of violent video games. He actually has wanted in the past to place restrictions upon them, and in 2013 he said that there was nothing stopping them from actually implementing a taxation against violent video games. And they also pulled off something odd. In the past he acknowledged that there's not substantial evidence linking video games to violence, but he also kind of said, well, you know, we shouldn't fear the facts if there is. So, I mean, overall, it does sound like he's the kind of guy who's probably hoping for that to be true, maybe. So, should a maybe anomalous report come out on that, maybe that is the type of thing that he would want to use as justification against violence in video games. But getting back to the latest story, let's dive into what Joe fully said. So, in an interview, he said that he was at a meeting regarding the protection of intellectual property rights for artists, and he said, at one point, one of the little creeps sitting around the table who told me he was an artist because he was able to come up with games to teach you how to kill people. And then he continued after that. Now, that's an interesting quote snippet, to be sure. Did some dickhead company executive say that? Could they have? I mean, yeah, they could have. The thing is, when Joe is talking about meeting video game leaders, what does he mean? Does he mean Bobby Kotick, so a big CEO who probably doesn't care about actual video games and maybe would say something like that? Or maybe Jason Vonderhaar, a lead designer at Treyarch, who maybe wouldn't say something like that? We just don't know, so it's impossible to verify there. Though, I mean, hearing douchey comments like that, you know, from the same people who do push loot boxes, gacha games, and psychologically manipulative mobile free-to-play games, I mean, I don't think you'd be surprised. I certainly would not be surprised. Now, Joe went on to talk about video game companies gloating about how they're an economic engine and a driver of employment, and they certainly are massive economically, but Joe then replied, well, you guys have got fewer people on your payroll than all the losses that General Motors faced in the last quarter. So that's the stuff that he dredged up in this interview, and he went on to say in this latest interview, the point is there's an arrogance about it, an overwhelming arrogance that we are the ones, we can do what we want to do. I disagree. So that's what Joe said. Now, as this relates to modern aspects of AAA gaming, I think many people would find some parts of what he said to be an agreeable thing. Personally, I kind of do think so, but I think that in isolation, because ultimately, I think this is a guy who would want to further regulate violent video game content. Now, for broader context of this interview, Joe's statements here center around disagreements over part of the Communications Decency Act, and a massive thank you to VG247 for actually, you know, just bringing that up, working out for us, and doing a breakdown. It's very appreciated. So the part of the act in question is about protecting platform holders from the actions of their users. Now, if you've heard about, say, safe harbor legislation, you know, it's pretty much similar to that. Basically, if the onus is on a platform holder to police its audience, then you're going to have more draconian things like, say, YouTube Content ID. So essentially, if safe harbor stuff goes away, then yeah, expect the free and open internet to become a lot more regulated, a lot more closed, and with all the power put into incumbents. Now, Joe said that he aims to, Joe aims to abolish that provision, saying that when technological revolutions happen, it takes a while for government to actually come in and to level the playing field again. Now, that's the kind of talk that starts to get into antitrust. Now, I'm sure you've heard of, say, the breakup of Standard Oil a very long time ago. That was John Rockefeller's oil company. Now, its dominance led to the Sherman Antitrust Act way back, was passed through pretty much unanimously, and the breakup of that company. Now, that's an example of monopoly busting. That's something that you will have heard as a key theme in the Democratic primary race, but also from really all sides of the political spectrum. Now, Joe here is talking about legislation not being caught up to reality, and he thinks that the playing field needs to be leveled there. But the thing is that actually once that playing field is leveled through regulation, it's ultimately just saved by the same boyos as before. That's just what happened with Standard Oil. So yeah, I'm sort of relating to slightly different cases here, but I think there is a similar theme that ties them together and that's very relevant to us. So your TLDR is this. Joe said that Silicon Valley game companies, game developers, are creeps, and he wants to abolish a provision that basically is a safe harbor policy. Now, what he wants here, I think, would not be good for the games industry. The big companies with resources could adapt easily to legislative changes, and it would be far harder for, say, a startup to then be competitive. A big change like that, would it hurt Activision Blizzard's stock price? Yes, but they will have the funds to adapt. A new company, though, if they're just starting up, well, suddenly they're going to be on the hook for a whole bunch more, and that would be far more damaging. So, between this and what you would hear from, say, the other sides of the aisle, like, President Trump did say a lot of things that were pretty much anti-violent video games, I think it is fair to say that politically, video games are an easy punching bag. And to explain that, I think it's easy to market anti-violence to people who are over 40s, over 50s, who don't know games, but, crucially, who do actually turn out to vote. Now, I'll tell you one thing, though. While I do disagree with Joe overall, and I do suspect that he broadly said that about developers, about them being creeps, and that he does want to curb video game violence, I will admit there are business creeps. Remember Torolf Jernstrom? Creep. Companies that do psychologically manipulative things and go whale hunting. Creeps. Absolutely. And with that said, let's talk about the NHS and what was recently said about loot boxes in the UK. So, mental health and loot boxes are incredibly tied together as, some people, more than others, are able to resist Skinner boxes, but many people are not able to. And a lot of modern games have turned into that, and it's ripe for exploitation. So, Claire Murdoch, the UK National Health Service's mental health director, issued a report claiming that loot boxes are basically under-the-radar gambling and that they're pushing kids towards actual gambling addiction. To break this down, she said that companies should not set kids up for addiction and that young people's health is at stake. The NHS article cites a few different reports, including notable bad cases of younger people overspending in video games, and it's got 3 core recommendations for gaming companies. Number 1, to ban sales of loot box games aimed at children. 2, to add spending limits, and 3, to make percentages clear to users and to support parent awareness. Now, the report also does reference the grey market, trading of loot box items like, say, CSGO Lotto. Overall, it's a lot of stuff that we've, sort of heard before. Some of it reeks of, save the kids, more regulation, but a lot of it's actually, I think, true. And to me, really, the moral judgment of a company is based on, or not all of it, but a part of it is, what are they willing to provide you as a consumer for value in return for your money? And if that's just, a gacha game monetization thing, I don't think that's a company that's really operating that much of a moral business in terms of their relationship with their customers. And in terms of loot boxes, there are people who are, going to be a lot more vulnerable to things like that. I mean, okay, I'm not going to do anything that could actually tie down to the person, but in the general sphere of people I know in my real life, there is one person who, had a gambling addiction, right? And that's the type of situation where if that person was introduced to those mechanics in video games a lot younger, it would have trained the same mental tics that led to that, that gambling situation. I think that is something that you do see across, just across society. I think it's a major problem, and it is an example of the games industry not taking on that much responsibility. Now, that said, there is some responsibility being taken by game companies, and in a lot of those cases where there has been massive overspending, parents could have controlled it, and this is something we've got to be really quite realistic and honest about. Parents are terrible at policing their kids. Policing is maybe the wrong word there, but there's a lot of parents who just don't know stuff. They don't know technology. There are so many parental controls. I remember in World of Warcraft back in the day, you could have, per hour time blocks that you could actually issue for your kids in that game. And those things are available in loads of different places, and they are just not commonly used. Could the industry do a better job of educating parents on those things, as the NHS, would say? I think that certainly is the case. They could do a better job, but those things are there, and there are cases where this stuff would have been preventable if parents used, the safeguards are actually available to them. Now, that said, that's just the safeguards that's there. I don't think it excuses the core business model of that Skinner box and how psychologically manipulative that it is. Now, that said, there's also dangers of some overregulation. As you saw in the Joe Biden situation, and as you see with, say, American political figures from across the spectrum, there's a lot of anti-video game rhetoric. Now, if you saw, I think it was the most recent roundup that we did, we talked about a province, prefecture even, in Japan, right? And it recommending a 1-hour play limit for minors. And then you see China, where there's very heavy regulation on what minors can do. Same goes actually in Korea. But then, you look back to the DCMS report and, all the chat back then, sometimes those Chinese things were brought up in a positive light in terms of restricting playtime for minors. Now, for me, I think that is a real infringement infringement on freedom and people's actual, their right to decide what they want to do. And it's the sort of thing that I also think would be a big backfire, because if you tell a kid you can only do this 1 hour a day, what's that kid going to do? I mean, it's just like me when I was a kid, I had a second router that my parents didn't know about. That's what kids do. So there's definitely some dangers of over-regulation, and I think a lot of that regulation wouldn't actually work that well. And if it did work, then it would be a big sort of quash on freedom, which would suck. So that is my thoughts on these issues. Let me know, though, what do you think down below? And with that, I will see you next time.